Yes, so thanks very much, Tamara, for that. And it would be remiss of me if I didn't acknowledge the fact that I live and work on Durrumbal country in central Queensland, on the Capricorn coast between Rockhampton and Yeppoon. So I acknowledge that the First Nations land has not been ceded to colonial occupation. But I do have a fun fact, or rather it's a fun experience. So my wife and I went to Garmisch-Partenkirchen a couple of weeks ago, as most of you I'm sure have done. And we took the Vankbaan up the, it's not Mount Vunk, isn't it? It's just Vunk. Anyway, up the hill we went, and of course I've taken this image across Garmisch-Partenkirchen right through to looking further north. And when you're up there, I don't know if you've seen them, but there are seats, you know, sort of benches, wooden benches. On each wooden bench is a quote, either from a Greek philosopher or some other luminary commenting on the environment. This one from Immanuel Kant. Now, those that know me well know that my Deutsch is non-existent, but my son has some good Deutsch, and he translated it like that for me. My son is in Canberra, works for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So if you've got a better translation, you, by all means, send it to me, all right? But that quote permeates the talk, and I think permeates the research that I wish to embark on, not just here at the Rachel Carson Centre, but also for the next sort of 3 years. All right, so firstly, I want to ask you a question. How many of you either live on or very close to the river? Perhaps in the riparian zone, you know, that is that first point above with the waterline. Okay, keep your hands up. Can I add those people who think they live on the floodplain? So if you keep the first lot, keep your hands up. If you wouldn't, sorry, you know, if you wanted to exercise, would have given you more time. Can I add to those people who think they live on the floodplain as it's defined? Hands up high. All right, take a look around, see who they are. Okay. You can put your hands down now. Can I ask those that think they definitely live above the floodplain? All right, so there's a few. Are you sure? What height do you live above sea level? So if you're about 530 metres or less south of the Deutsches Museum, then you're not. Can I just tell you? If you're south of that and you're above 510 metres, you're also not. Go and check your Google, not Google Maps, but Google Earth, and just double check. But essentially, you all have a stakehold in the Isar and the river. You have a stakehold in what it does, how it floods, or not, as the case may be. You are all interested in the river. Oh, and also you drink. You do, don't you? Yes, of course you do. So, you're not meant to read the next slide, all right? You're meant just to see that what we've got here is a mind map. It's a way of graphically illustrating what's in your head, what the research questions would be. I'm going to unpack some bits and pieces of that for you, but essentially that is the project, and the RCC component is a part of it. But it's what some people might call a conceptual model, and it's more a graphical version than the text that you often write. All right, so the question for me is, what got me to running river rights as an environmental humanities research project? How did that happen? Well, firstly, in Australia, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act 1999 is the main Environment Act which the federal government uses to manage environmental issues from a political perspective, and it's broken. It's well regarded as being broken, and the government is required to do a 5-year review on this Act every 5 years, and the last one was by Graham Samuel. Graham Samuel was a well-known Australian luminary who headed up the Australian Consumer Organisation. And he writes this: Australia's natural environment and iconic places are in an overall state of decline and are under increasing threat. The environment is not sufficiently resilient to withstand current, emerging or future threats, including climate change. The environmental trajectory is currently unsustainable. And last year, or this year rather, at the start of this year, in 2022, the 2021 State of the Environment report came out and essentially said exactly the same thing. And it's a bit like the IPCC. The State of the Environment report is put together by a collection of scientists. But essentially it confirmed the same sort of thing. The second thing that's happening, as you'll be well aware of in Australia, where they're using the term unprecedented. I think in 2021, Deutschland had its unprecedented flooding, did it not? But they're using the word unprecedented for flooding in Australia, particularly northwest of Sydney, where they've had 3 large floods in 2.5 years. So what does unprecedented mean, of course? Emergency services people saying, we've never seen this sort of flooding in our working lives. Of course, there have been floods, there have been big floods, but crucially what's been happening is that there's a lot of policy intervention by various tiers of government of how to address what's going on. Whether the current floods are unprecedented, I mean there's 3 La Niñas in a row, which is, itself provides a lot of atmospheric moisture. There have been large floods in the past, but now climate scientists are going to understand that they can attribute a percentage of various natural events to anthropogenic climate change. And thirdly, the reason I got interested in doing a river study for coming to the Rachel Carson Centre is that I live here near Rockhampton, and the Fitzroy Basin, which is the second largest river basin in Australia. It's the largest basin that flows into the Great Barrier Reef. That will tell you something. A lot of sediment can often flow into the Great Barrier Reef and therefore smother corals and so on. So the Fitzroy Basin Association is a not-for-profit resource management organisation that tries to bring farmers and environmentalists together to work on, for instance, reducing sediment into the Great Barrier Reef. And they took us to a project on the Fitzroy River, and they said, we're going to spend $7 million on putting in these piles for a kilometre of river so that the sediment is being constrained and kept in place. And I sort of thought about it for a while and thought, but we're on a big floodplain. So they're trying to constrain the river to its current course, but what about its floodplain? Doesn't a river utilise a floodplain? And the environmental engineer spoke about First Nations stories about how the Fitzroy River became dead straight after massive rains because it was utilising its floodplain. So this river winds around farm lines and fences. So the idea is, let's constrain the river, yes, to save sediment entering on the Great Barrier Reef, but also keep it in between farmers' fence lines on the floodplain. So can that be done? Will it be successful? What happens in the next big flood? And of course, we know the answers to those questions by and large. But that experience got me to asking the question about environmental policy interventions. And so let me unpack a little bit of the mind map. The significance of the research relies on the fact that climate change is evident, observable. In Australia, the climate models are suggesting, particularly for Northern Australia, we'll have the same amount of rain, but wet season will start later and finish earlier. So statistically speaking, that simply means more floods. In that case, what sort of planning, what sort of policy interventions are looking at increasing flood occurrence and the intensity that's currently impacting residents and the economy? Of course, building on floodplains means that the hydrology suggests the water doesn't soak into the groundwater, it simply floods across the surface, and very fast too. And as a result of urban pressure, there is poor water quality, again, being part of the reduction of biodiversity and ecosystem health. So that's the significance of what the research wants to look at, and it's connected to a number of research questions. You can see these are the mind maps that are being unpacked. The first one is, what are the environmental policy failings on rivers? And they're relatively well known, but the question behind it is really important. what societal environmental ethics assumptions underpin, and just for sake of focus, Australia, New Zealand and Deutschland river rights in the past. And so the allied questions become, for the future, what ethical discourse could be applied to river policy in the future? Okay, let's learn from the past. Now, what can we therefore apply to the future? And so what follows is, what policy and governance structures will advance river rights? For this research project, the output is an edited book. And the edited book will revolve around a critical realism discourse. Now, critical realism distinguishes between the real world and the observable world. The real world needs discernment independently from human perceptions, theories and constructions. Very Kantian, perhaps. For example, a river's flood. Well, that's observable. But what does it mean existentially to live on the floodplain? Critical realism asks why phenomena occur and recognises that emergent mechanisms, or thinking outside your experience, can explain some better outcomes. So there's a bunch of chapters which we propose. I'm going to unpack a couple of those. So just very quickly, they exist like this. There's likely to be more chapters, but essentially let me explain a couple of those. The first one I want to explain is the reflexive thematic analysis, because that's what I want to do here at the Rachel Carson Centre. So reflexive thematic analysis is a toolkit that investigates ideological themes. In this case, we'll investigate the ideological themes informing river property rights and ethics, certainly in the past. And so that's directly related to this research question: what societal environmental ethics assumptions underpin Australian, New Zealand, Deutschland river rights in the past? So, thematic analysis. Some of you might be aware of critical discourse analysis from Michel Foucault, at least underpinning his theories. This, I guess, is a more practical development of that, given that critical discourse analysis has its critics these days and has not particularly bounded by process, and deliberately so, of course. So reflexive thematic analysis will involve the use of in vivo software to pick out the themes amongst the documents that I want to obtain with these three river systems. So reflexive thematic analysis is a method for analysing and interpreting patterns across qualitative data. That's its key purpose. The reflexivity part is the practice of critical reflection by the observer, by the researcher, and it controls for bias. Reflexive thematic analysis has an interest in process and meaning rather than cause and effect. And it exists to be a cultural commentator on dominant cultural assumptions. For example, the book of Genesis has given Christendom its reason why it uses rivers so. It's a resource. We are in charge of it. God said so. But in fact, another theological reflection might be more about stewardship. We're meant to care for it. So they're the sort of questions that we want to sort of unpack in this sort of study under reflexive analysis. And reflexive analysis understands nuance, complexity and contradiction rather than explanation. And it tolerates a degree of uncertainty, similar to critical discourse analysis. So the process of reflexive thematic analysis, according to the authors of the book: firstly, dataset familiarisation. Get to know the documents that you're using very thoroughly. Go in and data code. So those that are familiar with critical discourse analysis and other sorts of processes will understand that this is a very intense process of finding out how you're going to code the software. You generate the initial themes and go through a review of those themes, and continually refining, defining and naming, and then of course the writing out process. So it's a sort of practical way of pulling out the themes from various documents. And I guess you'll be wondering, what documents do I mean? So what I hope to do is find the documents which have underpinned the policy responses to these three cases of river systems. And let me go through some of those. Firstly, the Murray-Darling, the Australian Murray-Darling river system. The Murray-Darling is the biggest river basin in Australia. It's over 3,000 kilometres long and 2.8 times the size of Deutschland. It nourishes 30,000 lakes and wetlands, and including 11 classified internationally significant Ramsar wetland areas. Now, it's been well written up. In fact, a previous RCC luminary from Emily O'Gorman has a number of publications, including this most recent one on the Murray-Darling, reflecting on its purpose and its intent and its importance. But there have been a number of high-level critical narrative journalism approaches to understanding the problems of the Murray-Darling system, this one by Margaret Simons, a quarterly essay in particular. Because water is contested. And certainly for the Murray-Darling, farmers want the water because it is the food bowl of Australia in many ways. But there's been a lot of argument, given the number of Ramsar wetlands, etc., why the environmental flows are not equally as important. So it's in a contested space. I mean, severely contested. There is, court cases around whether even the New South Wales government should be held to account by the South Australian government, where the Murray exits to the sea, of why they've been holding up their water. And so there are state clashes as a result as well. So it's a very combative environment, thinking about river rights, farmers versus environmental. In 2019, there were excessive fish kills, massive fish kills. Many people, of course, decided it was all about climate change. In fact, when the studies were done, it was more about the fact that the water was being extracted for agricultural purposes upstream that created these fish kills and the Murray and the Darling River drying up. For the New Zealand, I don't know if you're familiar with the Wanganui River, or Te Awa Tupua, 2017, given its person rights and thus legal status as requested by the iwi peoples, the First Nations of the area, and have been trying to get that for decades. There are documents around that which I'll be using. And the documents for the Murray-Darling are about cabinet papers and white papers which inform the government policy response to set up the Murray-Darling Basin Authority. And lastly, because I'm here in Munich, the well-publicised case of the renaturation of the Isar. So, because it flooded so often, a couple hundred years ago, and over that time, the rafting being a very key economic use of coal and plantation woodland coming down the river, it was made into a canal. And then progressively, since the sort of 60s, 70s and 80s, the Isar Alliance got together and put together with Bavarian authorities to create a renaturation of the Isar. And by 2011, I think was it 3.5 million? Anyway, some expenditure by government authorities. Then the river was, a lot of its banks and bends were put back together for a short period, for around about 8 kilometres. But there's a set of documents around that which informed that policy. So you see there are three very different policy interventions on the use of water. What makes them, what are the themes that makes them different, and what then can we learn to apply to new policy? So the idea while I'm here is I'm going to answer the question, what thinking has informed divergent river environment policy directions? Because of what we've got at the moment, a new Australian government that intends to rewrite environmental laws, replace the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, say that quickly, 1999, and create a new National Environmental Protection Agency. So now is the time to be asking some of these questions and then having some influence on what thinking might inform future water policy directions. All right, I'm going to touch on a couple of the chapters that we want to do in the book. And the first one is Our Knowledge, Our Way. It's our science organisation, government funded, CSIRO, Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation, has created a Indigenous-led research program called Our Knowledge, Our Way. So, you know, we need to learn from First Nations peoples. And I'll give you an example why we need to learn from First Nations peoples. You'll be well aware, of course, that Australia suffers from bushfires, not just floods, but bushfires. Now, these bushfires are often, aside from examples in California or Canada, get very hot because the fire ends up in the tops of the crowns, and eucalyptus, being an oil, explodes and you have a massive fireballs. But the First Nations people in Australia have been using fire to manage forests for a long time. And what they do is called slow burning. So they'll create a small fire, they will manage that fire, it will grow, it will burn only the grasses, that is the fuel, which creates big fires. It won't get up into the tops of the crowns. They manage it so it goes so slowly that fauna manage to escape. Even small lizards will manage to escape. And they do it in patches. This year, this patch. This year, another patch. And so they'll manage the fuel load, which if it is not managed, ends up in these very hot fires which destroy the environment over large areas. So there is now a move in Australia to manage forests utilising some of those principles. So for the river, the question is for a First Nations person, the environment is them. They are the environment. If the environment is ill, they are ill. And so that thinking we want to be led by, so Indigenous-led research. Creative writing and art, we think is going to be very, very important. It wouldn't be an environmental humanities project without that perspective. Let me give you another example. In the early 1980s, the Tasmanian government wanted to dam a number of wild rivers. They wanted to make hydroelectricity. And they met fierce resistance. In fact, it was the genesis of the Australian Green Movement. Bob Brown started. He was a GP, a doctor in Tasmania, and in his collaboration with the Wilderness Society really started Australia's Green Movement. But he and many others set up a number of blockades and other sorts of interventions. But it was this photograph that changed government policy. This is a photograph called Rock Island Bend by a Latvian immigrant to Australia called Peter Dombrovskis. And this photograph was picked out by Bob Brown, much to Peter's dismay, because he thought it wasn't the best of his pictures. And it was published in the Australian the Australian major newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald and the Melbourne Age, for a number of weeks, end on end. And that photograph is attributed to changing the then Hawke Labor government to utilise foreign policy to try to stop Tasmanian state environment policy and reverse their decisions on damming the rivers. And they did. And so scholars point to the fact that this photograph was the key. A piece of art changed policy. And I think that's very important. In fact, some other books that I've been reading recently, again, a person who's been through the Rachel Carson Centre, in their essay and book, Sabine Wilkie and David Farrier separately asks us to replace a narrative of progress, human progress, GDP, however you measure it, and thus mastery over nature, this First Testament theory that we have from Christendom, with a more poetic practice that models human-nature interconnectivity. What they seek is a combination of ethics for global environmental justice and responsibility for the future, and aesthetics, or an ecological and textual interrelatedness, to define poetic practice in the Anthropocene, using art to sell a science message. It can be overstated, and we'll touch that, or maybe your questions will touch that. So what we want is our book to be strategic storytelling. Now, strategic storytelling is a narrative with purpose, an educative purpose, a policy informing purpose. And I rather think that this strategic storytelling is a link with Dr., and I'm sorry if I pronounce this wrong, I'm terrible, Dr. Oya Kunli's complementary epistemology, a viable framework for environmental philosophy, a topic earlier in this RCC colloquium presentations. I think there is a strong link there because it's about education, it's about changing mindsets and art. Well, my wife and I, we visited the Lindbach House, and we were rather taken with the art of the Munich Blue Rider Collective, which were active during the decade leading to World War I. Now, in my view, Auguste Marquis' painting asks, how do we postmoderns see nature? Is it something to be experienced, but only in a controlled context? Only on a Sunday afternoon, firmly in its natural place? Should nature ascribe to a drab human homogeneity? And look, well, hey, while nature is really good, perhaps so long as cafe and cooker are close by. And so, just to juxtapose that, Professor David Suzuki, a Canadian environmental publicist, writes most famously, "The way we see the world shapes the way we treat it. If a mountain is a deity, not a pile of ore, if a river is one of the veins of the land, not potential irrigation water, if a forest is a sacred grove, not timber, if other species are biological kin, not resources, or if the planet is our mother, not an opportunity, then we will treat each other with greater respect." This is the challenge, to look at the world from a different perspective. And so lastly, nature-based solutions are a bit of a similar way to going down that path, with a nod to including economics in the mix. And as the ESA documentations will show, economics and the people's enjoyment are firmly in that mix, and so it must be so. But importantly too, science supports the idea that humans are happier with access to nature. I don't know if you've come across the term solastalgia, a medical depressive condition linked to degrading environmental values. And in this book, Eco-Anxiety and Planetary Hope, my chapter muses on a walk we did in Switzerland, where we talk about the fact that it's a very human-made walk amongst nature, and what does that all mean, and what does it mean for the future of nature. And Steve Mentz has encouraged me to put a little bit of paragraph of my own poetry from that book into here. Thanks, Steve. Not just the cows chasing summer flowers, also the age of the Anthropocene. Mergent emissions to air empowers a chemical cauldron heating the greenhouse aloft. Rainfall patterns then falter. Birds follow the plants that follow the rain. Now once, over epochs, such sojourns alter. But this change, too quick for evolution's gain. Have I got time for a question to the audience? I do, don't I? Here's a question for you. What's the difference between an outcome and an output? Who's game enough to answer that question for me? You know, there's output, and I've described the output of a book. Now I want to just move to outcomes. What's the difference between an output and an outcome? John, you're so quick, and because you're the only name I could remember, you better go ahead. Thank you. Well, give the man a clap, because he's exactly right. So as an output is something you produce But an outcome is something that will be made of that output, and usually by somebody else. So usually you, as the purveyor of knowledge, may not be the creator of the outcome. In this case, we hope this book will influence government. They, hopefully, yes, there are risks here, will create the outcomes. So if you like, take a Polaroid test. If I do something, and I take you remember the Polaroid, the camera that you took a picture and it gave you, in a couple of minutes' time, a picture that you could see? You remember those days? No, you're all too young, aren't you? Christophe will remember that. So you know, if you have done something and there is change when you take another photograph, then you have had an outcome. So that's the difference. And what we hope to have in our outcome is some transition studies. Now, our transition studies are concerned with long-term processes of radical and structural change to sustainable patterns of production and consumption. So our first goal is a transition study that somebody will hopefully do on Australian river rights policy governance structures. And since there is going to be a new EPA in Australia, what a great time. The second goal is a transition study to re-inform ethical values that shape Australian water policy. Some First Nations-led research, some art, some other sorts of things that say, hey, we don't want to be masters of the earth, we want to be partners with. We want to be the earth, we want the earth to be us in order to progress environmental policy. And then, you know, hey, maybe down the track, the Environmental Protection Acts of Parliament to force and affect river rights. I mean, as I say, the Whanganui took 30 or 40 years to reach its stages. But there are policy interventions along the way to depopulate the floodplain, land buyback processes, cultural spaces instead, conservation zones. Now, I'm not suggesting that we take away Munich and we, since 1200 or whenever, replace all the buildings and create a cultural space and park, but there will be opportunities to do that so that, you know, people will be able to afford their insurance because they're not living on the floodplain in a lot of cases, and that rivers are given back their floodplains under high energy level hydrology. They are then able to wander because there are ecological spaces we can utilise, because we're going to need climate change refuges. The koala, for example, will require climate change refugia. Places of natural habitat where they will be able to retreat to when the habitats themselves become too dry under climate change to create the right species for them. All those things are required. And so I come back to Immanuel Kant. And I wonder, can society achieve what Janine Grenberg, Professor of Philosophy at St. Olaf College, Minnesota, calls Immanuel Kant's ethics of humility? Not we are Lord of the earth, but an ethics of humility. So instead of our current human narratives of masters of the earth's resources. And, you know, I don't know if you're a fan of J.R. Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, but wouldn't it be good to achieve a eucatastrophe? Eucatastrophe, a term that Tolkien describes as an unexpected event that changes impending doom, a sudden and favourable resolution of events in a story, a happy ending. Eucatastrophe is another word for hope. But I wonder, what I invite is your input. And I wonder, I've got my email address there, I wonder if you have any ideas on how strategic storytelling might help environmental policy. How might rivers gain their rights and we achieve other sorts of ecosystem benefits as a result? How can art and literature be used to advance environmental policy? So if you've got any ideas, well, we've got question time, right? And I'll take notes. But otherwise, I invite your email on your thoughts. Thanks, tomorrow.